Welcome to the New Age Masonic Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the New Age magazine, predecessor to the Scottish Rite Journal. On this podcast, we take a deep dive into the articles of the history, people, and lessons of Freemasonry as written in the New Age magazine and their pertinence to both everyday, personal, and Masonic life. Hosted by brothers Maynard Edwards, 33rd degree, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree, and Chris Ruley, 32nd degree KCCH. Articles from the New Age magazine read by Matt Bowers and brought to you by the Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite, Southern Jurisdiction, Mother Supreme Council of the world. Welcome to the New Age Masonic Podcast, a podcast, thank you, dedicated to the articles of the New Age magazine, first published in 1904. I am one of your hosts, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, along with the Honorable Chris Ruley, 32nd degree KCCH, historian for the Valley of DC. Happy belated Independence Day there, Brother Chris.
Yes, that's right. Happy July 4th, or now July 5th today.
July 5th. So, recording this the day after the 4th of July, and when this is released, I think it'll be around the first week of October. You should have something being released, don't you?
October.
No. August. I'm an idiot. August.
Hopefully mid to late August.
August.
Yes.
Okay.
Fingers crossed on mid to late August.
Okay. Teasing something here that Chris is having published. You'll have to keep your eyes and ears open for that one.
That's right.
It's a good one too. It's a good one for sure. Anyway, this article is actually from very early on in the New Age magazine, from, I believe, October 1904.
Yes,
Right.
I think the one we sent. Yeah, so there's a couple different articles, or at least I sent you a couple different articles, and I think you and I had a chat before. We were like, okay, this is clearly something different. We've never done this before.
Yes.
This is different.
But don't say any more. Don't say any more.
Okay.
Than something. Yeah.
Perfect. Go ahead. I'll let you do it.
Clearly something different. From 1904, October 1904, it's called The Progress of Science. Very fun read, very interesting read, especially if you can keep things in the context of the time. Not something you necessarily hear about so much in 1904. Anything to add before we listen to the reading there, Brother Chris?
This is not going to be Masonic in practice, but we're going to talk a little bit about why it's important after you read the articles.
Yes. So here's my reading of the article, The Progress of Science, from the October 1904 issue of the New Age magazine. Arctic exploration again. Preparations are now being made for expeditions to the North Pole. In the United States, Lieutenant Perry has arranged for an expedition to start next summer, and the contract has been let for the building of a new Arctic ship for his use in the attempt the Dominion of Canada some time ago purchased a stout vessel for use in Arctic waters. This is the Gauss, which was used by the German Antarctic expedition of Professor von Dragowski, and which the Dominion government secured to send to Hudson's Bay with stores and coal for the government steamer Neptune, and subsequently for use in a survey of the coast of Labrador. Her commander, Captain Bernier, is anxious to employ the vessel in a polar expedition in 1905. Lieutenant Perry made his formal announcement on the night of September 14th at the Convention of International Geographers. He said in part, "The contract for my new Arctic ship has been signed and her keel is being laid now. This means that if I am alive, I shall start north again next summer in another attempt upon the North Pole. I have from now until the 1st of next July in which to secure the additional funds necessary to fit out and equip the ship. The ship will, I believe, be the ablest ship that ever pointed her nose inside the Arctic or Antarctic circles. She will possess such shape as will enable her to rise to the pressure of the ice floes and escape destruction. She will be very strong. She will possess such features as a bow as will enable her to smash ice in her path, and will contain such engine power as will enable her to force her way through the ice. In maximum dimensions, length overall, breadth of beam, and draft, this ship will be the size of the British Antarctic ship Discovery. In displacement, she will be somewhat less. In power, she will compare with our largest ocean-going tugs. She will have engines capable of developing 1,000 indicated horsepower continuously and 1,500 horsepower for a limited period. The voyage is short, and the crux of the whole project is the successful negotiation of the comparatively short distance of ice-encumbered channels extending northward from Cape Sabine to the polar basin. My requirements are a powerful steamer, capable of forcing her way through this comparatively short distance and demanding only a minimum amount of sail power to enable her to creep home in case all her coal is burnt. That is what I propose to build. My plan of campaign, in a very few words, is to force this ship to the north shores of Greenland, taking on board at Whale Sound the pick and flower of the Eskimos, with whom I have worked and lived so long, to go into water quarters on that shore and to start with the earliest returning light on the sledge journey across the central polar back, utilizing these Eskimos, the people whose heritage is life and work in that very region, entirely for the rank and file of my party. Shall I win? Heaven knows. I hope and dream and pray that I may. But if I do not, someone will. Turbines for steamships. The adoption of steam turbines as prime movers in the 2 new fast mail steamships to be constructed by the Cunard Company has been determined in accordance with the advice of an engineering commission which has been carefully investigating the subject for the company. This decision marks an important step in marine engineering, as the vessels are to be 760 feet in length and are to have a speed of 24.5 to 25 knots an hour, requiring the development of about 70,000 horsepower. They are to be the most modern and fastest craft of the size ever constructed, and the question of engines was most carefully considered. The decision to use turbines was reached only after an exhaustive study. On account of their size, the use of steam turbines in preference to reciprocating engines involved conditions different from those in channel and river steamboats and torpedo boats where the former have been successfully employed, and it was somewhat of a surprise to many to learn that there would be little, if any, economy in weight. Following the example in the case of the Lübeck, a German turbine cruiser recently launched, there will be 4 shafts, of which the 2 outer will be connected with the high-pressure turbine, while the inner pair will be connected with the low pressure and also with the reversing turbines. In accordance with the new approved practice for turbine vessels, there will be a single propeller on each shaft. It is believed that with the turbines planned, the speed requirements will be satisfied, but no extraordinary economies in fuel or weight are anticipated. Is seawater the basis of life? A communication has recently been made to the Paris Academy of Medicine in which experiments are described which tend to uphold the theory that seawater is the basis of all life, and from it have been evolved all animal organisms down to the human being. M. Quinton, who has performed these experiments, which in many ways corroborate the Darwinian idea of the evolution of species, shows that the human body is made up of the same elements as are in seawater, finding in addition to the more important constituents traces of elements which were formerly not suspected to exist in the human being. He has also demonstrated experimentally that seawater injected into animals has no toxic effect, but can take the place of blood. The claim is made under this theory that seawater forms a true source of nourishment for animal life. Wireless telegraphy in war. The important practical application of wireless telegraphy to the transmission of war news dispatches in the Far East has led to important diplomatic questions, but the advantages of the system seem to have been established. The newspaper correspondent is stationed on a small steamer which is free to cruise about the Yellow Sea, maintaining communication with the shore station at Weehaiwei, where there is a neutral cable. The vessel is rigged with topmasts to a height of 75 feet, from which are suspended the conductors from which the waves are emitted. There is a generator driven by a small oil engine, and everything is arranged so that messages at a rate of 25 to 30 words a minute may be transmitted, at a rate comparable with ordinary submarine cable working. By the use of telephones in connection with the receiving apparatus, it is possible to detect the signals when sent over considerable distances, and the results have been fairly successful. As wireless telegraphy has been used also by the Japanese Navy, there has been some confusion of signal between the news messages and the military dispatches. But as the transmitting apparatus of the former is so arranged that synchronization of the signals takes place, the receivers were able to pick out those especially designed for the corresponding station. A wireless system has also been provided for Lake Baikal by the Russians, while nearer home and under more peaceful auspices communication has been established between Port Limon, Costa Rica, and Bocas del Toro, Panama, with the pronounced intention of also equipping a station at Colón.
Okay, we're back. Brother Chris, admittedly, I have to say you kind of button-hooked me on this one. I was not expecting either of these articles of this nature whatsoever.
That's right.
So with that in mind, give us a little bit of background on how the New Age magazine started, how it came about. What was the vision for the magazine? Was the purpose of the New Age to show that Masons did more than just Mason, in big air quotes, and
right.
What were there shared similar interests with non-Masons?
Yeah, I think to me, one of the great things about the New Age magazine, its earlier run, the first couple decades, is that the New Age magazine was not the magazine that we think of today, like the Scottish Rite Journal. And so there was a really big push to make this not just a magazine for Freemasons, but it was a push to make it for a general audience. So if you could believe it, the first half of the New Age magazine had very little to do with Freemasonry. It had to do with art. It had to do with music and sciences. There were these recurring themes and recurring articles. There were travel articles. So to me, whenever I talk about the New Age or I help explain the New Age magazine to people who are either not Masons or never really heard, or Masons who've never heard about that those first couple decades, the magazine was effectively a National Geographic plus Freemasonry. And so they had these articles on travel, on arts and sciences. And so there was this one thing called Progress of Science. And so this was a recurring series. It actually started in October of 1904. So this is the first year of its publication. And just as you noticed, as you skillfully did the articles, these are small snippet articles, or small snippet pieces rather, on different things, on different topics. And so basically gave the reader this just general knowledge, general news about what's going on in quote unquote sciences. What's the progress of science? And so these could be about chemicals. These could be about aviation. These could be about physics, astronomy, just all these different. I think there's one about warfare, about wireless telegraphs. And so it's this general thing that helped the reader. It filled the pages of the magazine. It helped talk a little bit about science and progress of science.
Well, and to actually skip around from my order of questions that I had typed out, the topics mentioned, like you said, they go from exploration to hydropropulsion, which in 1904 is not something I would have considered to have been a topic discussed in anything. When I think of hydropropulsion, I can't even say it. Hydropropulsion. When I think of that, I think of, the hunt for Red October.
That's right.
Here's a Russian submarine that can, park off the coast of the United States within, a couple 100 miles. I don't think about that in the context of 1904. I think of 1904. Did you watch Henry Feed the Pig? That's my frame of reference. Obviously, I wasn't alive back then, so I don't know any better.
Yeah, I mean, if from a historical standpoint, if you look at the progress of technology, the innovations of technology, the turn of the 20th century really is this, immense wave. Really, it's a wave of new technologies, new applications of technologies. You go from an older, century to a new century with just, we're talking about 4 decades, 5 decades later, the space race, you go from electricity to, this rapid increase in technology. And so here is, which I find so fascinating, reading these articles and going through the old pages of the New Age, we are watching the evolution of technology, science, the progress of science as it's written. Through these pages, you're seeing, names of early inventors. You're seeing prominent names of inventors and scientists and folks who are working on the things that would be eventually something that let's say Einstein, people are referencing things that Einstein would have mentioned. So it's interesting to me that from a editorial perspective, this is the kind of stuff that they wanted in the magazine. They didn't want it just to be about plain Jane Freemasonry. They didn't want it just to be about Scottish Rite. They didn't want it just to be about mysticism. They wanted to bring in and expand and talk about, and really this is commentary on our ritual, where it talks about how, as a Mason, you should go out and learn about the 7 liberal arts and sciences. You should learn, in yourself. You should improve yourself through education. And this was a conduit, right? So not only addition to stories and articles on science and news and drama and math or advances in mathematics, you got a little sense of Freemasonry, you got a little sense of what's going on at the Supreme Council. And so this book really was, and I said it before and I'll say it again, this book really became a National Geographic for Freemasonry for about 2 to 3 decades. So the first article, the first Progress in Science, comes out in October 1904. About a year later, 1905, they changed the title and it becomes Science, Innovation, and Industrial Arts. So they even expand on that because there's such an interest that they want to add more stuff to the articles. And so they started to bring in things about, business practices. I think there was one on, what was it, like the mass production of prunes in the United States, this weird, topic. But the idea was you get a whole centered approach in while you're reading this, you get a lot of information, you get a broad swath of information about different topics, and you make yourself a slightly, a more reasoned or centered person.
So, and again, my lack of context, because I wasn't around back then and certainly haven't studied it, these heady or techie topics were very popular for the time, not just in the day that we live in with laptops and tablets and cell phones and access to everything, within a few keystrokes with your thumbs.
Well, if you look at other Masonic publications, so you have to also think about the context of Masonic publishing at the time. After the Civil War, we see a massive, and Larissa Watkins, for example, librarian at the House of the Temple, has done a lot of research on cataloging all the Masonic periodicals there were. We see a massive, massive increase in the number of periodicals on Freemasonry that get published, newspapers, journals, standalone pamphlets. We see this huge influx after the Civil War. And so now we're in the turn of the 20th century. We're in 1904. What's 1904? 1904 is before the big world wars. That year was the World's Fair, where there was a lot of interest in electricity, telecommunications, or not really telecommunications, but just communications in general. And so curiously though, I don't see, and Larissa hasn't seen it, a lot of other articles or publications that were including or adding these types of recurring themes and articles to their publications. So what I'm trying to say, in other words, a lot of the periodicals at the time were focusing on interesting updates in Freemasonry. Some professor finds a manuscript and reproductions of manuscripts. So it's still really focused on the art of Freemasonry, the science of Freemasonry, history, ritual, perhaps perspectives or retrospectives on certain things. Guys who were publishing these pamphlets and journals were not really focusing on, hey, let's introduce or let's take a look at what the Smithsonian's working on and try to, add a little stuff to that. They were keenly focused on, I want to make this the best Masonic publication, and so I want to focus strictly on Masonic topics. So it's sort of interesting that George Fleming Moore and then later on John Cowles and the editorial team for the New Age really said, well, no, wait a minute, let's widen our perspectives. Let's take a look at, there's actually another recurring article. There was another recurring theme, another recurring article on music and drama. So they would go out and, listen to plays and concerts and theater, shows, and they would bring back and say, these actors are really good actors. Here's where you can check them out. They were doing sort of the variety of what you would see now today in criticism. And then there was a whole entire recurring series on the woman. Or it was called I think it was called On the Homestead, or discussions on the homestead, which focused on women's topics. Now, this is a very antiquated. This is not the women of today. This was on, how to keep a home or how to manage a home, issues dealing with your husband, advancement of your children's education, these sort of things that we consider now traditional. But at the time, for a Masonic publication, very, very progressive, very out there, very, very new age.
In doing a little bit of research on my own, some of these periodicals, the Masonic periodicals that you mentioned from 1850 to 1904, there was Mackey's The American Quarterly Review of Freemasonry.
Sure.
And Americans Freemasons New Monthly Magazine. So, I guess I could kind of see where, what was it all? Well, they were short-lived for one thing. So
that's right.
Was that all? Was that potentially due to money as well, as opposed to just the interest that they were just focusing on Freemasonry? And you mentioned all the things that were going on in 1904 with the World's Fair and stuff like that, and communication technology and so much more. Was it just by, for lack of a better term, dumb luck that in 1904 the Scottish Rite decided to start the New Age?
Well, so let me tackle part of those questions. So in the beginning, when we talk about all these periodicals and magazines and journals, and even you cited Mackey, Dr. Albert Mackey, who at the time was the Secretary General of the Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction. He, while he was in Washington, while he was serving as Secretary General, created, I think it was called the National Freemason. That was a 4 or 5 volume periodical publication that was, that he tried to, sell, and he attempted as best as he can to make it a profitable endeavor for himself. But unfortunately, a lot of these publications just folded because of money. Masonic periodicals and publications were just not really making a lot of money. And you can even see that with the early New Ages. There was an attempt in the first couple decades to make it a subscription-based model. And what they decided to do was, in order to, get some interest and get everyone excited, the Supreme Council made that publication free for, I think it was the first year for new members, or actually all members. And then they made several different attempts. They said, well, we'll make it available for those who are 32nd degree or perhaps newly initiated 32nd degree. We'll give them a year copy or an annual subscription. And then over time, they just tried everything they could to make this subscription model work, but unfortunately it couldn't. But fortunately for them at the time, this is 1910s, 1920s, you're getting into a very busy period of Freemasonry in the United States. And so they had enough money where they said, we're just going to pay for everyone to get a copy. And then every month they were going to get a copy of the New Age, regardless if they were a new Scottish Rite Mason or old. Every single person got a copy of the Scottish Rite magazine. And so the New Age became one of the most, because it was funded directly by the Supreme Council, it became one of the biggest circular Masonic periodicals out there in the United States and even abroad, because it even went to Europe, it went to Latin America, it went to different parts of the globe. And so it became one of the largest because the Supreme Council effectively paid for it. If they went through the subscription model, if they did everything like the other periodicals and publications have done for the last, 4 or 5 decades before the New Age magazine, it probably would have folded because it just could not financially keep itself afloat.
It was really eye-opening to me when you sent me all the information about the New Age, and going through stuff, and I'm expecting something similar to our Scottish Rite Journal that we have today. And even before reading this article on the Progress of Science from 1904, I'm seeing poetry.
Yes.
And it totally threw me off. So I keep digging through, and more magazines, more poetry, stories, just completely unreal. And part of it was confusing, but it was also it was kind of refreshing to see something completely different for the time.
Yeah, and that's right. And you remember at the time they had a pretty big, I'd say like 12 people were working on this. Right now we have, I think, a team of less than 5, and by 5 I mean, there's volunteer writers, there's a graphic designer who's working on layout. So it's not the big machine that it was for 100 years ago when there was a lot of people contributing. There were recurring articles and columnists, and so it was just a different operation. It was a larger operation. It was something that they wanted to try, and for whatever reason, unfortunately the proceedings of the Supreme Council don't really tell us what was the rationale. They sort of just kept funding it over years. And so it's also interesting, for the first couple decades, it was sort of like, well, we're going to keep funding this for the next 2 years. And then we get to the next biennial session, then we'll determine, do we want to keep this thing? But they just kept doing it and kept doing it. And then by the time they get to the 1920s, the 1930s, when they're seeing that this is not just a really good magazine to share with people, but this is the way where the Grand Commander can communicate with people. This is another way where we can, really focus on Freemasonry and what we want to focus on in the Scottish Rite. And as you alluded to before, that National Geographic style really dies out, or it gets phased out when George Fleming Moore leaves office, and then he's succeeded by John Cowell. John Cowell changes the flow of the magazine, the change of the magazine. He starts to add articles focusing on himself, right? Like the Journeyings, which was an article of where the Grand Commander basically traveled. It was a travel log of his own personal travel around the jurisdiction. Here's how I'm contributing to helping out the jurisdiction. I went to, the Valley of Santa Fe, and then I went to Houston, and then I went to California. And so that was his thought of what he contributed. So in many ways, when a Grand Commander took office, the New Age magazine became a communication arm for the Grand Commander. How is he going to do it? What are the types of articles we're going to do? What are the types of things that people are interested in? And so that first decade, or first 2 decades rather, of the New Age magazine was really dedicated to George Fleming Moore, and Moore was interested in making it like a National Geographic magazine.
Was there ever any pushback when a new SGC came in, and wanted to change things with the magazine? What more culturally added to the change of the magazine?
No, I think after Moore retired, there were very few, if any, problems with the magazine, and I put problems in quotes. I meant like feedback from readers or subscribers. I could understand in the first couple decades of the magazine where Moore was in charge, because if you remember, we actually talked about this in a previous video. Moore was a very progressive Grand Commander, or he was a very provocative Grand Commander. He thought, we can use Masonry to solve political problems or solve political issues. And so many in the Supreme Council at the time thought that this was a dangerous thing, because we don't want to, Freemasonry has always had this, separation between politics and religion, and Freemasonry, we don't get involved in those things. And so they didn't necessarily want to change that. While Moore was like, well, Freemasonry is such an interesting and a great principled institution that we should be more active as Freemasons in politics. And so that scared a couple people away. He resigned because of other issues that he had with the Supreme Council. And so when Coles comes in, he said, okay, well, the magazine is going to reflect what I think is important as a Grand Commander. And so, by tradition, or perhaps by custom, very few people now are, they see the New Age magazine, as an arm of the Grand Commander, as a communications arm of the Grand Commander. And there was very often any pushback on that. The Grand Commander basically had carte blanche. He effectively decided what would be in the magazine. He could take things out, he could put things in. And so those types of internal struggles and battles that you would have, perhaps were there, but we really don't have a good record of it because those were sort of kept quiet.
And just thinking about this now, do you know if any of the articles from, say, Albert Mackey's the American Quarterly Review of Freemasonry, or the American Freemasons New Monthly Magazine, do you know if any articles from those were ever published in the New Age at any point?
If there were, there'd be so few that I could not find any in my review of the New Age. Most of these, very rarely. Let me say this: very rarely were articles Masonic articles, non-Masonic articles, like during those first couple decades where there were stories and science. Those were pulled from different sources.
Right.
When we're talking about Freemasonry, very rarely were things pulled from different publications and used for the magazine. They had enough people submitting articles. They had enough people, pulling, submitting or saying, hey, I'm going to write an article on the biennial session, for example. So they always had content, and obviously they ran the gamut. It was not just history, it was science, art, philosophy of Freemasonry, it was ritual, it was, historical perspectives. So when you go through, a New Age after Fleming Moore's term, so that's right around 1921, 1922, I would say around 22 to 23 and 24, you see the shift over to the new Grand Commander's influence. And so Calls is looking at, just give me Scottish Rite stuff, give me Freemasonry stuff. I don't care about stories that have nothing to do with Freemasonry. I don't care about science. I don't care about drama or arts. I don't care about, the women's recurring article. I just want Freemasonry and focus on that. And so I think, you're getting a lot of new stuff. And of course there were recurring articles, recurring authors, right? And so there was a couple guys in DC, like Henry Richard Evans, who was a local Washington Valley guy who contributed. The editors or the assistant editors would contribute their articles, and there were, and we document this in the Scottish Rite Journal. If you've seen the last couple Scottish Rite Journals, for example, there was a guy named Mysticus. Now, Mysticus was a name, a pen name for one of the brothers, but he wrote a lot of stuff on ritual. And so there were recurring articles in that sense, but very rarely were they being pulled from different sources, or, certainly nothing around art or science or drama.
To kind of wrap it up, I enjoyed reading every bit of this. Again, my lack of context of everything tech oriented from 1904 was changed. It was obviously a big to do, and again, it was fun to read something from. I didn't realize it at the time, that didn't necessarily start as a Masonic publication.
Yeah, the New Age magazine during this period might be my favorite period because it was so broad, because it brought in articles and topics and stories and poetry and all these things. It was a hodgepodge. It was really the most significant, different thing. It was this different publication. It was, as I was jokingly call it, the National Geographic of Freemasonry. And we don't really see this anymore in other journals. We certainly don't see it in the Scottish Rite. We certainly don't see it in, I don't think Grand Lodges are pulling stuff from Reader's Digest, or they used to pull stuff from Reader's Digest. It's just this unique thing. For like a couple decades, the New Age magazine was just this interesting thing where you literally can turn the page or open the New Age magazine book and not know what it would cover. It could cover literally anything and everything. And that's certainly exciting if you're a reader. It's certainly exciting if you're interested in history. And I think it's certainly exciting if you're interested in the Scottish Rite.
Well, another fun thing to see as well that I just thought of were the ads in the magazine at the time. So, and one of them that was, I didn't realize how long they'd been around, is from actually your publisher, there were ads from McCoy all the way back in 1904, and that kind of threw me off. I'm like, whoa, I wasn't even thinking of how long they'd been around,
That's right.
doing things Masonic related. That was kind of fun to see too.
Oh yeah, well, McCoy was, I think, we have letters between Albert Pike and Robert McCoy, because Pike used McCoy to publish a lot of his work and a lot of his books and things. And so there's certainly a nice relationship with McCoy and the Supreme Council. That's also, I appreciate you mentioning that, the advertisements. I think that's where, when someone like you, I think you just asked an earlier question, well, when did we move over from, that National Geographic style to the, focused only on Freemasonry? That shift occurs. And so when you look at the books in the 1920s and 30s, you start to see very few, if any, advertisements anymore. That's when the Supreme Council basically just said, we're going to just paying for this subscription and we're just going to give it to everyone.
Right.
And so you can sort of clock where the subscription model is in its like the maturity of or the lifetime of the magazine. If you open the magazine up in the first couple pages, you see advertisements for Masonic jewelry, for books, for sashes and regalia. That's when the magazine was still in that subscription model. And then when you crack it open in 1930s or 1940s, when it just goes right into, Scottish Rite or Freemasonry, that's when you know that the system has shifted over to the Supreme Council's paying for this. We don't need subscription models. Let's just get to the content. And so that's a good observation, Ben.
And this might seem kind of silly. Another thing to read, and you don't see it until much later on, after there's been some background with the magazine, is that they actually used to publish not obituaries necessarily, but like an in memoriam for brothers across the country. And you just see, especially as you get into the 40s and 50s, you see brothers that were born in the late or sometimes mid 1800s. And this, for me, again, this is completely ridiculous sounding, but I read some of those birth dates for some of those brothers years ago, and I'm like, there's a brother that quite possibly grew up without indoor plumbing.
Oh, absolutely. And probably in Washington, D.C. I mean,
yeah, right.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true. Yeah, I think that generation certainly, or that period certainly speaks to me, because you would have been what, 19? Okay, let's say you were born in 1850.
Right.
That means by 1900, you were what, 50 years old, 60 years old? You weren't retired yet in at least today's standards, because
right.
you were back then. So you would have seen the you would have seen, well, let's say take a brother who, was born in 1850 and lived 80 years. They would have seen World War I. They would have seen the Civil War.
Yeah.
They would have seen the Spanish flu. They would have seen they wouldn't have seen the Mexican American War, but they certainly would have been, they would have been alive at the invention and the spread of the telegraph, electricity, gas lamps, and all these types of things, transportation, flights, airplanes. I mean, that's amazing to me. And in fact, there was this is pure coincidence, but I was watching a YouTube video. I forgot the title it was an old game show in the 50s. Or excuse me, probably the 30s or 40s, not really the 50s. And it was called I've Got a Secret. And one of the contestants was this really, really old man. He was 96, 98 years old. And his secret was he saw, or had a vivid memory, he was present at the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Now, this is a guy who survived and saw both world wars, and he was on TV. There was a human being who was present at Ford's Theater, and he was on TV in that video recording in 1940 or whatever, talking about that moment and what he felt. Now, he wasn't old enough to remember what was going on, but he said that he was old enough to understand that something was going on. He saw a man jump off the balcony, and he was worried about that man who jumped off the balcony. He didn't really realize that, the president of the United States was hurt.
Well, and not to mention too, you mentioned, if a brother had been born in 1850 and he lived through or saw the Civil War, well, depending upon where that brother grew up, that portion of the Civil War could have quite possibly been in his backyard.
Correct. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is an even crazier, scarier thing to consider.
And imagine, and perhaps he ran a good life and he had a good life, and he got to 1910 when there were, radio broadcasts and, newsreels. And I mean, it's utterly fascinating that advance of technology. And that was why I think personally, unfortunately, a lot of the papers, especially for George Fleming Moore, those papers are no longer, we don't really know where they are, if you can believe it. Some of those papers are certainly not with the Spring Council. So we don't have a lot of those, papers from discussions and work that they were doing in the committee to get these books, published. But I would venture to guess that Moore thought that because of such, rapid escalation of technology, rapid progress of science and technology, they wanted to capture this and share this with people because they thought it's important. And so I think that's one of the reasons why they included it as a recurring article in the magazine for, I think, up until 1915. So for 15 years, they had that recurring article in some capacity,
right,
in the magazine. So for 15 years, they were talking about latest advancements in technology and sharing that with people, sharing that with Scottish Rite Masons. And I think that's one of those just interesting things, those things that we don't talk about, but to me make a great impact.
And I just thought of this, and it makes me kind of laugh a little bit. You talk about a brother that's seen the telegraph and the phone and silent film, talkie films, and there's kids today that don't know what a landline phone is.
Yes.
Or even a rotary phone for that matter.
It's so funny that you say that. I was commenting on with a colleague at work that the save symbol on a computer is a floppy disk. And they were commenting on how would a Generation Z know what a floppy disk is or what the save button is. They only know it as the save button. They don't know it as one of the floppy disks that we had to insert as when we were kids.
Oh yeah.
So that's one of those interesting little curiosities.
It's crazy to think. Well, I enjoyed this article, and I think when I have the opportunity to dig through some of the old issues of the New Age, I'm going to try to find more of that stuff just from my own personal curiosity to see what people were interested in, because it's certainly not something in a general education history that you would ever necessarily read about unless you took some sort of specific course on what media and what people were learning about it at those times. It's very generalized what you learn in most areas. So, any other parting thoughts, sir?
Parting thoughts? No, I would just say, thank you for listening to this episode. This is certainly a lot different than some of the other episodes we covered in terms of the topic that we talked about today. But please keep an open mind. I hope to do more of these different non-Masonic themed articles. I think people will find that interesting. And if you get an opportunity if you live close to a Masonic library that has old copies or perhaps your valley has old copies of the New Age magazine, if they go back to 1905, 1908 to 1910, just flip through one and take a look at the types of things that they were talking about, the types of articles that we were publishing, the types of things that they found so interesting that they wanted to share with other Scottish Rite Masons throughout the country. And I think you'll find a better understanding of how unique and different that period was of the New Age magazine.
Yes, thank you everyone for listening to us on the New Age Masonic podcast dedicated to the New Age magazine, first published in 1904. I am one of your hosts, Matt Bowers, 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason, along with the Honorable.
Nope.
Brother Chris Ruley, 32nd degree KCCH. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time here on the New Age Masonic podcast.